Hello and welcome back to my channel. For this video, I had recorded a little bit as I went along of explaining what I was doing in my thought process, but this was a very experimental painting, so I actually want to try doing a voiceover well after the fact to explain what it was that I was doing. Because really, this painting was about the journey, it was not about the end product, although I did end up liking how it turned out. This painting started off as following a Skillshare tutorial on how to do limited color palettes. It was a very specific take on limited color palettes where it was not just about your palette, but about how many different values and hues you are allowed to mix for one painting, which is very different than how I normally paint, which is what made it a challenge. Essentially, what I wound up doing with the colors was every single color you see in this painting, except for one. Every other color is a mix of 3 colors. I used burnt sienna as my red, I used Royal Talon's light blue as the blue, and I used yellow ochre as my yellow. And I used a different ratio of those colors for each color I mixed in this entire thing. But the real challenge was I limited it to being a mid-tone, a shadow, and a highlight for each color and no more. In fact, in some places I didn't even do that much. The result was a very graphic looking landscape. I had to be very strategic about the shape of my shadows and the shapes of my highlights in order to create forms. Because normally I blend over and over. I just layer and layer multiple different shades on top next to each other. I blend them out and I love doing that. But you gotta step out of your comfort zone sometimes, which is what this entire painting was about for me. So you can see here that I'm mapping in my shadows, and then I'm blending it, I say in quotation marks, by stippling, or in other words, doing little dots all over the place to create an illusion of blending, even though really nothing is blended until we get to the water, where, spoilers, I break the rules a little bit. Even for the sky, which is normally a gradient for me, because when you look at the sky, it gets paler toward the horizon compared to higher up. I resisted the urge to make it a gradient, and instead, I did that stippling technique. Since there wasn't a lot of variation in the values for the trees, I depended on the bark texture to define their shapes and to separate trunks where there was some overlap. And here's where we get to that rule breaking I was talking about, which ended up being my favorite part, probably because I got to do a little bit of my blending. The water was so much fun to do in general because it really was a challenge to make it look like water. I mean, water is a subject that's already difficult without putting limitations on yourself. And here I'm trying to make it look like it's actually flowing and reflecting instead of being this big dark blue blob that it started off as. So I let the paint just naturally have a gradient to it as I made my paint strokes downwards, and then went in and created the ripples, but it still wasn't quite there. And I realized it's because with the distortion in light that the water does naturally, I needed to go in with the darker color and fudge it up a bit here and there, which is the only place in this painting where I do that, but I feel like I held back just enough for it to fit within the painting and not seem like it doesn't belong there. It's currently raining outside, very cozy. One thing that's interesting about how the painting looks now is that the white I'm using is not matte like most gouache is, which annoys me usually, but with this, when you see it at different angles, it's like there's actually reflections in the water, which I think is very neat. I am gonna go in with highlights that are more like this color here, you know, in the grass and some extra foliage in the foreground. We'll see how it goes. I'm really nervous about this green here that I'm trying to match with that. So I'm actually gonna let this dry fully before I plop it on the piece, because last time I did that for this painting, the pink ended up so much brighter and darker when it dried than I wanted it to. I tested it, but I didn't let it dry, which gouache changes a lot when it dries. Future Alyssa is back, and I just want to say that that giant lime green blob in the middle of the piece does get covered up. Don't worry, I fix it. So stay tuned to at least see that get fixed up and not look like, what, is that like a slime monster in the middle of the piece? It may as well be. And look at that, the promise is being delivered. I'm fixing that weird patch of sunlight that accidentally became a slime monster. Now, I don't know why, but so far in my landscapes, the most difficult thing for me to get right is the rocks. They just end up so blurry for some reason, and then I have to go in and overcorrect and make the most graphic Lara Croft shaped rock, you know, all of the angles, all of the triangles, and it works enough to get it to be a passable rock. But in this particular painting, with the limitations that I put on myself with the not blending and everything, in order to make a mossy rock, I had to introduce some interestingly colored shadows and highlights. It has been getting progressively darker while I've been working on this. Well, the lighting's fine in my room for me. On camera, for some reason, it looks like my painting is glowing in the dark. Just the green. But even without the glow in the dark effect my camera is having, I'll admit that green ended up so much lighter than the test strip, and I don't know why. Okay, maybe it's the same, and I'm just confused. Glad I stepped away for the night because I could see the colors better, and that green was in fact wrong. So minimal that most people will not notice. Some people do not have the color perception to notice, even if I notice. But, you know, giving it a night and a fresh look made me realize that it was in fact missing something, and that's what my problem was. I was blaming the light green, but now that, you know, I see it in the morning, new coffee, fresh brain, I realize that the problem is in the green, it's that it's missing flowers. As we're getting to the end of this painting, I just want to say that I could not have predicted where this painting was going to go, since it was so experimental and challenging for me. But not just, you know, the end product, but really what I learned from this is why I value it so much. It's been over a year since I painted it, to be quite honest, and it did not completely shift my art style to being this graphic, no blending style. But I did learn a lot from it, especially in terms of how to mix colors that all work so well together, by being bold enough to put my reds in my greens and my yellows in my blues, even though it doesn't look like I accidentally made the river green, hopefully. And it was great for practicing at how to be very intentional about how I'm carving out these forms in my paintings. I've grown so much as an artist over the last year, and editing this video I can really see that growth jump-started with this painting. Yeah, I hope that you enjoyed this video, maybe even learned something from it, or laughed at me. Whatever you got out of it, I hope that you enjoyed it and that you leave a like, maybe even subscribe if you're feeling up to it.